Just as the Horus Heresy was the event that defined the Imperium of Man, so the Fall was the event that defined the Eldar. But where the Imperium still managed to hold itself together, albeit through brutal repression, and remain a single, cohesive, and mostly unified political entity, the Eldar Empire was irreparably shattered. Each of the major factions of the Eldar is defined by how they reacted to the Fall and how they try to avoid a second one from occurring. In the case of the Asuryani, the Craftworld Eldar, that response and that method is rigid, unyielding discipline. The Craftworlders are technically the largest faction of the Eldar, but again, since this is a dying race clinging to the edge of survival, that's not saying much. But they are also arguably the oldest of the factions. They don't simply predate the fall like the Exodites do, they also predate the decline of the Eldar Empire. The first Craftworlds were likely created late in the history of the Eldar Empire, as the Eldar themselves were growing bored with their existence and were looking for things to get the blood pumping, as it were. The Eldar who lived aboard them in those days were kind of like the Gypsies. They did a lot of trade, some business with the Eldar Crown Worlds, the worlds that made the heartland of the Empire, but for the most part, they were explorers. They would spend centuries at a time away from home, traveling through new and uncharted regions of the galaxy, and sometimes returning with a souvenir or two to impress their friends back home. After all, centuries are no great span of time for the nigh immortal Eldar. Even so, it was these extended trips away from home that may well have saved the Craftworlders from sharing the fate of the rest of the Eldar population. For most Eldar, the decline into degeneracy was so long and slow that most didn't notice it until it was far too late. Meanwhile, because the Craftworlders were often away for so long, every time they came back, they would notice how more and more society had changed. The Craftworlders took note of the sensation cults and of the increasing levels of depravity in Eldar society, and realized that this could only end badly. Once they realized that the decline was inexorable and could not be stopped, the Craftworlders immediately turned around and began leaving Eldar space as fast as their vessels could manage. There were a selfless few, though, that stayed behind to try and recover those Eldar that hadn't yet fallen under the sway of the sensation cults. Tragically, regardless of how fast or how far they fled, many Craftworlds were consumed by the fall and the birth of Slaanesh. Those few that survived have spent the next 10,000 years or so wandering through the galaxy, the last sad remnants of a dead empire. But the Craftworlders, like all Eldar, are nothing if not stubborn, and just like their massive vessels, they have managed to endure. And while the Craftworlds originally started out small, some have grown to the size of planets, each containing its own distinct remnant of Eldar civilization. How does a starship grow, you ask? Well, it depends on the right material. The superstructure of a Craftworld is comprised entirely of a substance known as wraithbone. Unsurprisingly, like most fictional substances in this and many other fictional universes, wraithbone is only ever described in the vaguest terms, usually as the substance of the warp itself psychically compressed into a solid material form. The short and simple answer is, no one really knows what wraithbone is or how it works except the Eldar themselves, and unsurprisingly, they're not telling. The only thing known for sure about wraithbone is that because it is made through psychic means, it can be altered by psychic powers as well. Every Craftworld possesses a certain cadre of psychers known as Bone Singers, whose sole purpose is to maintain the structure of the Craftworld and help it grow, to suit the needs of its population, hence why Craftworlds are able to grow larger over time. In fact, wraithbone is so ubiquitous among the Craftworld Eldar that they use it to construct pretty much everything, from tools to weapons to military constructs. But as I said at the beginning of this video, what really defines each Eldar faction is what they believe to be the cause of the fall and what they do to hopefully avoid a repeat. In the case of the Craftworlders, they believed that it was because the Eldar had lost self-control. As I said in my Fall of the Eldar video, Eldar nervous systems are far more advanced and in tune than that of any other race in 40k. As such, Eldar can become addicted to strong sensation or emotion. This, according to the Craftworlders, led to the widespread popularity of the sensation cults and, of course, the birth of She Who Thirsts. Therefore, according to the Craftworlders, the best way to avoid falling into the clutches of Slaanesh is rigid self-control. The big downside of this, of course, is that it makes it hard for the Eldar to replenish their numbers. Whether they ever developed cloning technology and then forgot it, or simply never bothered in the first place, the Eldar are simply unable to replicate themselves very effectively. And because lust is a very strong sensation and something that Slaanesh constantly thirsts for, replenishing their numbers by sexual reproduction is extremely risky. This is the reason why, even though 10,000 years have passed since the fall, the Eldar are so few in number, as even what we would consider boring vanilla missionary sex increases the likelihood of Slaanesh getting his/her claws on their souls. Unlike the other three Chaos Gods, Slaanesh is a unique, albeit unintentional, creation of the Eldar, and thus has a special claim on the souls of the Eldar race. Given that Slaanesh also happens to be a god of torture and rape, it's therefore not very surprising that Eldar of all stripes would rather anything than fall into his/her clutches. The Craftworlders try to avoid this by means of devices known as Spirit Stones. Much like Wraithbone, no one really knows what they're made of or how they function. All that is known for certain is that a Spirit Stone is supposed to contain the soul of an Eldar once he or she dies. The Spirit Stone is constantly worn on the Eldar's person, and so when he or she dies, the soul goes into the stone rather than being sucked into the warp, where it will likely fall prey to Slaanesh or any of its demonic minions. Assuming the Spirit Stones are safely recovered, they are then implanted into the Wraithbone of the Craft Worlds, and the souls trapped inside join what is called the Infinity Circuit, essentially the closest thing to an afterlife the Eldar have, at least an afterlife that doesn't involve being torture-raped for all eternity. Essentially, it's like an Eldar soul is data, and the Infinity Circuit is like a hard drive on which it is stored. Spirit Stones can also be implanted into various Wraithbone constructs, essentially enabling an Eldar to still fight on behalf of his race even in death. And these constructs can range from the Wraithguard, which are roughly human-sized, to the massive Revenant and Phantom Titans, which are, as the name implies, essentially the Eldar equivalent of Imperial Titans, only made out of Wraithbone instead of steel. The big problem is that Spirit Stones can only be obtained on the former homeworlds of the Eldar Empire, the so-called Crone Worlds, which, of course, happen to exist inside the massive warp rift that is the Eye of Terror, which, of course, is inhabited, among other things, by the mortal and demonic followers of Slaanesh. The Dark Prince of Pleasure's lust for the souls of the Eldar is no great secret. As such, killing Eldar and taking their Spirit Stones is a great way for Slaaneshi cultists and demons to curry favor with their patron. But as I said earlier, Craftworld Eldar are defined by a life of rigid discipline, and this discipline is exercised by something known as the Path System. The best way that I can sum up an Eldar path is like this. Say one day an Eldar wakes up and decides that he wants to be a cook or a sculptor or a soldier. Well, he then basically adopts the disciplines of that path and dedicates himself to it to an almost obsessive degree. The idea being that he is so focused on mastering this particular skill set that he will neither succumb to boredom nor the temptations of decadence that brought about the fall. While this is indeed true and so effective that all Craftworlders use the path system to one degree or another, it's not without its cost, and that cost is to become lost upon a particular path. To the Craftworld Eldar, a full life is obtained by experience. By experiencing as much as possible, so many different ways of living, so many life paths, so many disciplines and studies. To be lost upon a path, therefore, is to become so obsessed and so focused on one particular skill or discipline that the Eldar in question can no longer abandon that path and take up another one. Those Eldar that are lost to the path are both respected for their great skill, but also pitied because of their obsession. A Craftworlder that has walked many different paths has developed different aspects of his personality. Thus, he is considered a more rounded and complete individual. By contrast, one who is lost upon one path is deemed to be the Eldar equivalent of monomaniacal, not only incapable of dedicating his life and ability to anything but one skill, but also incapable of perceiving the universe from any perspective other than the one dictated by his path. A sculptor can never fully comprehend the winding paths of the seer, while the soldier will never fully grasp the simple joy of gardening. There are several known paths that an Eldar may take in the course of his long life. For example, the path of the artisan, which is pretty much what it sounds like, a path that covers all artistic disciplines, from sculpture to painting to anything that can even remotely be construed as art. There is also the path of service, essentially when an Eldar decides to dedicate a part of his life to what humans would consider menial tasks, out of a sense of duty and service to his people. There are the paths of awakening and dreaming. These two paths are more philosophical than vocational. The path of awakening is dedicated to external awareness, an Eldar learning to see every detail of the world around him, no matter how minor. In contrast, the path of the dreamer is focused on looking inwards and meditation. The big danger here being that Eldar on this path can become so caught up in this dreaming state that they often need someone to keep an eye on them and make sure they don't starve to death. Then there is the path of the mariner, where an Eldar learns to pilot a ship, from the smallest fighter to the largest craft world. There's also the path of command, in which an Eldar learns to become a political and military leader of his or her people, and one day perhaps earn the rank of fleet commander or autarch. But of course, the last two paths, the path of the seer and the path of the warrior, are the ones that we know the most about, because after all, this is a galaxy where there is only war. Now, all Eldar are psychers to one degree or another, but seers are those that have actually dedicated themselves to the development and honing of their abilities. One who walks the path of the seer can have many uses to a craft world and its people. There are the aforementioned bone singers who maintain the wraithbone structure of the craft world itself, the spirit seers who are charged with handling spirit stones and the activation of wraithbone constructs, and warlocks, former soldiers turned seers who lead troops into battle, like psychic field officers. But the path of the seer is also a treacherous and twisting one, and delving into the ways of the warp can be dangerously addictive for Eldar with potent abilities. Those who become lost upon this path are referred to as farseers, and are often the greatest psychers of their race. Equally dangerous in its addictive potential is the thrill of combat and the path of the warrior. All Craft World Eldar are given some modicum of military training and are expected to fight in the Craft World's defense as guardians. But the guardians do not count as being on the path of the warrior. They are simply the Craft World's militia. To walk the path of the warrior is to be an aspect warrior, which means dedicating yourself wholly to the art of combat. Unsurprisingly, of all the forces of the Eldar, the aspect warriors have the most information about them. So much, in fact, as to require a separate video. Suffice it to say, they are the most iconic of all the Eldar fighting forces, and those that are lost upon the path of the warrior are referred to as exarchs. Technically, there is one more path, but as you might expect from its name, the path of the outcast is more a rejection of the path system. Unsurprisingly, some Eldar do not find a life of strict regimented discipline very appealing. These Eldar, either under their own volition or after being kicked out by their leaders, spend their lives wandering the stars, completely free to be their own person and do as they like. For some, the charm of a solitary existence wears thin after a while, and they eventually return to their fellows, while others become enamored of this way of life, sometimes joining forces with others of like mind as corsairs, raiding the shipping of other races. Unsurprisingly, given how dangerous the 40k universe is, such Eldar rarely last very long. But in their minds, this whole effort to stave off extinction is a futile gesture. If the Eldar race is doomed to die off anyway, at least these Eldar figure they can go out in a blaze of glory, or at least die having fun. But these are ultimately the minority. Most of the Asuryani are stoic, determined people, hell-bent on one day bringing about a restoration of their race and their civilization, even as the paths of fate narrow and the grim darkness of the far future grows ever darker around them.